Hello everyone, this is Bradley. Today this is going to talk about how to make a preset or actually build your own nodes in animation nodes. Firstly, there is a new playlist I created called AM preset, namely animation node preset. And there were already 3 videos inside because I've mentioned some presets building to speed up my workflow. A very good example is the one in shader motion graphics that you can use the FOV to change the color of the object. This is also indicates that the new playlist has a lot of overlapping with the animation nodes fundamental playlist at some point. But there will be some circumstances that I converted some of my tutorials into a preset, and this won't be shown in the fundamental list. Then simply to briefly show you again the workflow of preset before we finally go through the basics of building your preset. So here's a very simple setup in which I've instanced a sphere over a grid through these distributed matrices and the object matrix output. And for each sphere, I have a vertex color enabled, and I'm going to use a node, a preset that I created for myself, which is called a vertex color transition list. So now nothing happens right now. I'm going to take a FOV, object controller FOV, and I'm going to select an empty, a spherical empty I created. And so now if I'm controlling this empty, it will change the color of the node. And you can also change the interpolation, like make the things sharper and so on. So this is, I think this is a very interesting part in the motion graphics where you can change the object color and so on. You can also change the type to directional and defines their transition and so on. There are lots of ways you can work with that. So in this case, I'm using 6 nodes to accomplish this function, but in reality, if you don't have this preset, it may add maybe about 5 to 7 nodes, I suppose. I actually forgot, but this is the reality. So up to this moment, I think I don't need to spend hours to explain why you need a preset. But the question tends to be how to make a preset, and this is also the topic today. So firstly, I suppose you realize the preset that I'm mentioning is a subprogram, which is not very much different from the subprogram that I created in my other animation node tutorial. Meaning that the subprogram essentially is a group of trees, a loop or whatever stuff that needs to be present in the files. So I saved all my subprograms in a preset node tree, and this is my library, and it's still growing. And yesterday I just updated these 2 trees and so on. So they need to present in your files. And I highly recommend you to use the file default and save startup files to save this node tree in your startup if you really use them very frequently. And I highly don't recommend you to append the node tree. The reason is that the animation node tree is essentially linked to the scene. So if you append the node tree, to avoid the fighting between the scenes, so if I have a sphere here and I have a sphere in the appended files, they will collide each other. So the animation node will automatically create a scene 001. It's easy to fix just by make the scene 001 back to scene, but sometimes it can also cause other problems. So in general, you can try by yourself, but I'm not a fan of appending node tree in these circumstances. Or maybe this issue might be fixed in the future or not. But so this is the reality. You have to have all these nodes present in your files. I really use animation node very frequently, so I have to build a library and keep them in the startup file. Let's go to the next stage about how to actually build all these subprograms. How to get a subprogram in the first place. So there are 2 kinds of nodes that can be used to create a subprogram. One is called group input node, and the other is called the loop input node. And by selecting these nodes, if you hit W and it goes to right, then you can invoke a subprogram, and this will turns to be your presets node, and this is equally true to the loop input. And just for knowledge, if you rename this group input like the presets node, then everything is readily searchable from the search. So this really turns to be an actual node that you can reach. So that's why it can be a preset if you save the files in other places. So the next question is when to use the group input for a preset and when to use the loop input for a preset. And to do that, you have to firstly understand the function for each of them and the difference between them. Although I have made a tutorial talking about when and how to use the loop nodes in animation nodes, but I'm still going to discuss that again in this tutorial. But I still recommend you to watch that tutorial in case there's anything that I haven't really covered here. So the reason we're using loop in many circumstances in animation node is that there are certain nodes that cannot receive multiple inputs, including objects mesh data node. So let's create a different meshes like whatever stuff. And if I'm selecting this cube, then it will output 8 vertex locations because I have 8 vertices of this for this cube. Here's the thing. What if I would like to know the vertex location of all these objects, cube, plane, and sphere? I'm not going to really replicate this mesh object inputs for 3 times to do such kind of function. Instead, since they're all in the collection, I'm going to use a collection info and set the collection. And I'm going to put ideally, if I put all objects into the object socket, it should work. But the reality is that it does not work. This is because for some reason this object socket can not receive multiple inputs. In comparison, there is a node which is called object transform outputs, and by activating that, you can put objects into the object socket. It will transform objects into objects, and you can use a single location to control the location of all these 3 objects at the same time. Certainly you can input multiple locations into this socket as well, so that all these 3 objects can go to a different location. But all these kind of events cannot occur with this mesh object input node. So in reality, if you really would like to put all these objects into the object mesh data node, what you need to do is you select the node and hit W, and it goes to write loop through objects. So here you're input a list as the iterator to the loop, and within each loop you're inputting an object which is a single component from the list. And now you can connect this object into the object socket of object mesh data. And to output all these vertex locations, you can hit this plus icon and output the vector list, because location essentially is vector data. So now if you hit W, goes to view, you can see we have 494 vertices, which includes the vertices of cube, plane, sphere, and so on. So this is the idea. So actually, in fact, in this particular case, this is already turns to be a preset. If you put all this yellow boolean to parameter. So here we already have a such kind of presets in which you input an object list and it will output all its vertex locations. Just to mention that if you would like to change the name of these outputs, you can select this output node and hit N, and in this advanced node settings you can change its name, like just name that as a vertex location, and it will work. Okay. I don't know if there is a practical usage for these presets, but this is just an example. So let's talk about something realistic in real life. So it again goes back to the initial example that I showed to you. It's called a vertex color transition list, in which you feed objects, and by using a for, you're changing the vertex color of all these objects and so on, which is cool. The reality of these presets, it contains a set vertex color in addition to the object mesh data, and even for this set vertex color, it cannot receive multiple inputs. So you have to use a loop input for the preset. However, here's the thing, that what if, for whatever kind of reasons, I already have a loop outside and I'm going to use this preset, then what should I do? So if I directly put this object into object list, because it's not a list, so I have to create an object list. And this by itself already generates a problem. That the reason I'm creating presets is because I would like to shorten the usage of nodes, improve the maintenance of node tree and so on. So basically make it cleaner. But now I have to generate an object list and increase the spaghetti. This is not preferred. And also by using loop input, sometimes it generates many other issues. Just also giving some other ideas. So assume I'm not going to put a list in the iterator. So let's just remove this object in the iterator. But I'm going to take a single object in the parameter and connect it to the object mesh data. Be aware that you cannot put a single object in the iterator, because it always thinks that a loop is supposed to run several times. So it's not possible to set that to 1 because it's meaningless. And now you evoke subprogram, and you can put the object into this parameter. It's fine, but now you're not getting anything. This is because you have to turn the iteration to 1 so that this loop will be run at least once. So if you put the iteration to 2, then this loop will be run twice. But it's just running the same thing over and over again, so it's meaningless. So let's put it back to 1. So this is the thing that you need to concern, that here's the iteration is something you need to change, but in most kind of circumstances in this case, is you just need 1. So you have to manually keep that to 1 and prevent any accident that changes to 0 or 2, where it generates meaningless data or just doing nothing. So in that case, really, why not just use set vertex color directly, in which you can directly put an object into object. So instead of having this iteration, I'm simply going to use a group input for my preset. So let's take for example, object mesh data. Let's just take this object mesh data and put all the inputs into locations. And we are going to output the vertex location as we done previously. So now in this case, we have basically the same corresponding preset. But this time we don't have iteration. And this is really just a difference between the group input and the loop input. So if I were to summarize the difference between the loop input and the group input, is the group input is basically just a loop input that will definitely run only once, not twice, and not 0 times, and so on. This is really just all the difference between them. And I suppose I gave you kind of ideas in which kind of circumstances it might be better to use the group inputs instead of loop inputs, and so on. And again, going back to the realistic life example. So initially, I think I showed you this vertex color transition list. I suppose you already realized there's also a comparable preset, which is called the vertex color transition. Vertex color transition loop. So these are two comparable nodes, but the difference is that for the list node you feed a list, but for the loop node you feed a single component from the loop. This is really just a difference. So these are two nodes are essentially really the same. These two nodes are really the same. The only difference is whether you feed a list or whether you feed a single object. The internal content are really just the same, and you're doing the same function as well. But the good part is both of them, they are used in two different circumstances, and I think it's the best case that you can do. And this is just one of the many basic concepts about creating the presets. When to use the loop inputs for making the presets, and when to actually use the group inputs for making the presets. I understand my naming is definitely confusing at some point, like the lists presets is actually a loop input, but the loop preset is actually a group input. But I think also the reason for me to do that is kind of clear, because for the loop presets, it's supposed to be used within a loop. But for the list preset, you are feeding a list to that. And this is the idea. Another thing that I would like to mention is that you might think to generate two presets doing basically the same function is a lot of work, but in reality it's actually not that hard. So if we go to presets and take a look about, basically this is it. So I have already done with the loop preset, and the way I generate a list preset for that is basically just use a loop input and put object into object and so on and so forth. It's really just repeating the same thing. The only difference is I'm putting an object into the iterator, so that in reality, if you invoke the subprograms, it's actually a list outside. So this is really all about it. And in this case, it's the moment you're trying to use the group inputs and the loop inputs and so on and so forth. The reason I specifically mentioned this is because I hope you to realize in my shader motion graphic tutorial, I used only the group input to make all these presets. However, you should have ability to put them into the loop so that make a list preset in which you can feed multiple objects for the functions. Because sometimes I might be really tired in generate a loop all the times for these dumb functions and so on. And this is basically it. I think I will stop here, and in the future we will really talk about more about how to build a preset and the realistic preset that can potentially increase your workflow and so on. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I'll probably see you next time. Bye bye.